it would be foolish to let them go unheeded. Now, men say, such things are not destined for our days. May the great God above grant that to be so. But come, the day surely will, and in accordance with his nature, man will be honored. This next part, which is the final part we're going to cover today, is called the Dark Days. And this is the aftermath of this particular thing, whatever it is, the destroyer coming through the skies, and this is what happened to Egypt. And this is during the time where Moses is leading them out during the Exodus. This is a really incredible passage. The dark days began with the last visitation of the destroyer, and they were foretold by strange omens in the skies. All men were silent and went about with pale faces. The leaders of the slaves which had built the city to the glory of Tom stirred up unrest, and no man raised his arm against them. They foretold great events, of which the people were ignorant, and of which the temple seers were not informed. These were the days of the ominous calm, when the people waited for they knew not what. The presence of an unseen doom was felt. The hearts of men were stricken. Laughter was heard no more, and grief and wailing sounded throughout the land. Even the voices of children were stilled, and they did not play together, but stood as silent. The slaves became bold and insolent, and women were the possessions of any man. Fear walked the land, and women became barren with terror. They could not conceive, and those with child aborted. All men closed up within themselves. The days of stillness were followed by a time when the noise of trumpeting and shrilling was heard in the heavens. And the people became as frightened without a herdsman, as asses when lions prowl without their fold. The people spoke of the God of the slaves, and reckless men said, if we knew where this God were to be found, we would sacrifice to him. But the God of the slaves was not among them. He was not to be found within the swamplands or in the brick pits. His manifestation was in the heavens for all men to see. But they did not see with understanding, nor would any God listen, for all were dumb because of the hypocrisy of men. The dead were no longer sacred and were thrown into the waters. Those already entombed were neglected, and many became exposed. They lay unprotected against the hands of thieves. He who once toiled long in the sun, bearing the yoke himself, now possessed oxen. He who grew no grain, now owned the storehouse full. He who once dwelt at ease among his children, now thirsted for water. He who once sat in the sun with crumbs and dregs was now bloated with food. He reclined in the shade, his bowls overflowing. Cattle were left unattended to roam into strange pastures, and men ignored their marks and slew the beasts of their neighbors. No man owned anything. The public records were cast forth and destroyed, and no man knew who were slaves nor who were masters. The people cried out to the Pharaoh in their distress, but he stopped his ears and acted like a deaf man. There were those who spoke falsely before Pharaoh and had gods hostile towards the land. Therefore, the people cried out for their blood to appease it. But it was not these strange priests who put strife in the land instead of peace. For one was even of the household of Pharaoh and walked among the people unhampered. They're talking about Moses. Dust and smoke clouds darkened the sky and colored the waters upon which they fell with a bloody hue. Plague was throughout the land. The river was bloody and blood was everywhere. The water was vile and men's stomachs shrank from drinking. Those who did drink from the river vomited it up, for it was polluted. The dust tore wounds in the skin of man and beast. In the glow of the destroyer, the earth was filled with redness. Vermin bred and filled the air and face of the earth with loathsomeness. Wild beasts afflicted with torments under the lashing sand and ashes came out of their lairs in the wastelands and cave places and stalked the abodes of men. All the tame beasts whimpered, and the land was filled with the cries of sheep and the moan of cattle. Trees throughout the land were destroyed. No herb or fruit was to be found. The face of the land was battered and devastated by a hail of stones which smashed down all that stood in the path of the torrents. They swept down in hot showers, and strange flowing fire ran along the ground in their wake. The fish of the river died in the polluted waters. Worms, insects, and reptiles sprang up from the earth in huge numbers. Great gusts of wind brought swarms of locusts, which covered the sky as the destroyer flung itself through the heavens. It blew great gusts of cinders across the face of the land. The gloom of a long night spread a dark mantle of blackness, which extinguished every ray of light. None knew when it was day and when it was night, for the sun cast no shadow. The darkness was not the clean blackness of night, but a thick darkness in which the breath of men was stopped in their throats. Men gasped in a hot cloud of vapor which enveloped all the land and snuffed out all lamps and fires. Men were benumbed and lay moaning in their beds. None spoke to another or took food, for they were overwhelmed with despair. Ships were sucked away from their moorings and destroyed in great whirlpools. It was a time of undoing. The earth turned over as clay spun upon a potter's wheel. The whole land was filled with uproar from the thunder of the destroyer overhead and the cry of the people. There, as the sound of moaning and lamentation on every side, the earth spewed up its dead. Corpses were cast out of their resting places, and the embalmed were revealed to the sight of all men. Pregnant women miscarried, and the seed of men was stopped. The craftsman left his task undone. The potter abandoned his wheel, and the carpenter his tools, and they departed to dwell in the marshes. All crafts were neglected, and the slaves lured the craftsmen away. The dues of Pharaoh could not be collected, for there was neither wheat nor barley, goose nor fish. The rights of Pharaoh could not be enforced, for the fields of grain and the pastures were destroyed. The highborn and the lowly prayed together that life might come to an end, and the turmoil and thundering ceased to beat upon the ears. Terror was the companion of man by day, and horror the companion by night. I'm going to skip down a little bit so I can get to the part where they're chasing. There were 9 days of darkness and upheaval, while a tempest raged such as never had been known before. When it passed away, brother hurried brother throughout the land. Men rose up against those in authority and fled from the cities to dwell in the tents in the outlands. Egypt lacked great men to deal with these times. The people were weak from fear and bestowed gold, silver, lapis, lazuli, turquoise, and copper upon the slaves. And to their priests they gave chalices, urns, and ornaments. Pharaoh alone remained calm and strong in the midst of the confusion. The people turned to wickedness in their weakness and despair. Harlots walked through the streets unashamed. Women paraded their limbs and flaunted their womanly charms. Highborn women were in rags, and the virtuous were mocked. The slaves spared by the destroyer left the cursed land forthwith. Their multitude moved in the gloom of a half dawn, under a mantle of fine swirling gray ash, leaving the burnt fields and shattered cities behind them. Many Egyptians attached themselves to the host, for one who was great led them forth, a priest, prince of the inner courtyard. Of course, that's Moses. Fire mounted up on high, and its burning left with the enemies of Egypt. It rose up from the ground as a fountain and hung as a curtain in the sky. In 7 days, by Remwar, the accused ones journeyed to the waters. They crossed the heaving wilderness, while the hills melted around them. Above, the skies were torn with lightning. They were sped by terror, but their feet became entangled in the land, and the wilderness shut them in. They knew not the way, for no sign was constant before them. They turned before Nashari and stopped at Shokoth, the place of quarries. They passed the waters of Maha and came by the valley of Pictaroth, northward of Mara. They came up against the waters which blocked their way, and their hearts were in despair. The night was a night of fear and dread, for there was a high moaning above the black winds. From the underworld were loosed, and fire sprang up from the ground. The hearts of the slaves shrank within them, for they knew the wrath of Pharaoh followed them, and that there was no way of escape. They hurled abuse on those who led them. Strange rites were performed along the shore that night. The slaves disputed among themselves, and there was violence. Pharaoh had gathered his army and followed the slaves. After he departed, there were riots and disorders behind him, for the cities were being plundered. The laws were cast out of the judgment halls and trampled underfoot in the streets. The storehouses and granaries were burst open and robbed. Roads were flooded and none could pass along them. People lay dead on every side. The palace was split, and the princes and officials fled, so that none was left with authority to command. The lists of numbers were destroyed, public places were overthrown, and households became confused and unknown. Pharaoh pressed on in sorrow, for behind him all was desolation and death. Before him were things he could not understand, and he was afraid. But he himself well and stood before his host with courage. He sought to bring back the slaves, for the people said their magic was greater than the magic of Egypt. The host of Pharaoh came upon the slaves by the saltwater shores, but was held back from them by a breath of fire. A great cloud was spread over the host and darkened the sky. None could see except for the fiery glow and the unceasing lightnings which rent the covering cloud overhead. A whirlwind arose in the east and swept over the encamped host. A gale raged all night, and in the red twilight dawn there was a movement of the earth. The waters receded from the seashore and were rolled back on themselves. There was a strange silence, and men in the gloom it was seen that the waters had parted, leaving a passage between. The land had risen, but it was disturbed and trembled. The way was not straight or clear. The waters about were as if spun within a bowl. The swampland alone remained undisturbed, and from the horn of the destroyer came a high shrilling noise which stopped the ears of men. The slaves had been making sacrifices in despair. The lamentations were loud, and now before the strange sight there was hesitation and doubt. For the space of a breath they stood still and silent. Then all was confusion and shouting, some pressing forward into the waters against all who sought to flee back from the unstable ground. Then, in exaltation, their leader led them into the midst of the waters. Through the confusion, yet many sought to turn back into the host behind them, while others fled along the empty shores. All became still over the sea and upon the shores, but behind the earth shook and boulders split with a great noise. The wrath of heaven was removed to a distance and stood upwards of the two hosts, and still the host of Pharaoh held its ranks firm, in resolve before the strange and awful happenings, and undaunted by the fury which raged by their side, stern faces lit darkly by the fiery curtain, and then the fury departed, and there was silence. Stillness spread over the land while the host of Pharaoh stood without movement in the red glow. And then with a shout, the captains went forward, and the host rose up behind them. The curtain of fire had rolled up into a dark billowing cloud which spread out as a canopy. There was a stirring of the waters, but they followed the evildoers past the place of the great whirlpool. The passage was confused in the midst of the waters, and the ground beneath unstable. Here in the midst of the tumult of waters, Pharaoh fought against the hindmost of the slaves and prevailed over them, and there was a great slaughter amid the sand and the swamp and the water. The slaves cried out in despair, but their cries were unheeded. Their possessions were scattered behind them as they fled, so that the way was easier for them than for those who followed. And then, I'm not going to be able to finish this. We've come 90 seconds down to the end of the show. I do hope that you guys enjoy the listening audience. I hope you enjoy this. Alan, I apologize I didn't get a chance to give you final comment, and we'll talk to everybody soon. I appreciate you listening in, for joining us for another show, and I am going to do a follow-up where we bring out some more information as far as the destroyer, and this is also one of the songs from Destiny Lab. God bless everybody. We'll talk to you next week.
What exactly would you say if your child looked up at you and asked you about God and if He exists and if He's true, and wondered what would happen when someone dies? Is there a heaven? And what about that man up on the cross? Am I forgiven? How exactly would you answer those hopeful little lies when you're college educated and convinced it's all a lie? Sure, you went to Sunday school when you were young, but that was then. You're above those simple thoughts now. The only God you know is man. Are you saddened and ashamed to tell this little soul that you don't believe in anything and have no reason and no hope? There's no heaven and no meaning. There's no purpose to our lives. Did you believe we're just evolved, random mutations come alive? You know better than an insect, son, and when you die, that's it. I've learned through education that good and bad just don't exist. It's all just evolution. It's survival of the fittest. And we can get you a prescription when your life becomes depressed. I'm sorry that I've crumbled all your hopes and all your dreams, but it's time you realize that life's not what it seems. Are you lost? Are you alone? Are you convinced that life does not make sense? Have you forgotten that God even exists? Have you replaced all that was real for a life of benefit and created your own truth? A happy atheist. Are you lost? Are you alone? Are you convinced that life does not make sense? Have you forgotten that God even exists? Have you replaced all that was real for a life of benefit and created your own truth? A happy atheist. You realize your
Filling was heard in the heavens, and the people became as frightened without a herdsman, as asses when lions prowl without their fold. The people spoke of the God of the slaves, and reckless men said, if we knew where this God were to be found, we would sacrifice to him. But the God of the slaves was not among them. He was not to be found within the swamplands or in the brick pits. His manifestation was in the heavens for all men to see. But they did not see with understanding nor would any God listen, for all were dumb because of the hypocrisy of men. The dead were no longer sacred and were thrown into the waters. Those already entombed were neglected, and many became exposed. They lay unprotected against the hands of thieves. He who once toiled long in the sun, bearing the yoke himself, now possessed oxen. He who grew no grain, now owned the storehouse full. He who once dwelt at ease among his children, now thirsted for water. He who once sat in the sun with crumbs and dregs was now bloated with food. He reclined in the shade, his bowls overflowing. Cattle were left unattended to roam. It would be foolish to let them go unheeded. Now, men say, such things are not destined for our days. May the great God above grant that to be so. But come, the day surely will, and in accordance with his nature, man will be honored. This next part, which is the final part we're going to cover today, is called the Dark Days. And this is the aftermath of this particular thing, whatever it is, the destroyer coming through the skies, and this is what happened to Egypt. And this is during the time where Moses is leading them out during the Exodus. This is a really incredible passage. The dark days began with the last visitation of the destroyer, and they were foretold by strange omens in the skies. All men were silent and went about with pale faces. The leaders of the slaves which had built the city to the glory of Tom stirred up unrest, and no man raised his arm against them. They foretold great events of which the people were ignorant, and of which the temple seers were not informed. These were the days of the ominous calm, when the people waited for they knew not what. The presence of an unseen doom was felt. The hearts of men were stricken. Laughter was heard no more, and grief and wailing sounded throughout the land. Even the voices of children were stilled, and they did not play together, but stood as silent. The slaves became bold and insolent, and women were the possessions of any man. Fear walked the land, and women became barren with terror. They could not conceive, and those with child aborted. All men closed up within themselves. The days of stillness were followed by a time when the noise of trumpeting and shrill